read by Dale Grothman. The Telltale Band of Yellow by Hamilton Craigie. Chickenfoot Dara, with a skinful of cheap Italian red wine, lurched, stiff-armed, against the basement grill. The warp treads of the ancient staircase creaked under the pressure of careful footfalls. Then, at what he saw, outlined in the red circle of the single gas jet, Dara's loose lips sagged open. Stark, elemental fear strangled the outcry in his throat. His blunt fingernails met like talons hooked into the basement gate. A moment he stood thus, while above him, like a face without a body, there floated against a dark pool of blackness the dreadful head, like in its semblance to nothing animal or human, save in the broad porcine snout. For a moment it held against the red glimmer of the gas, which, in a debased aureola, seemed to pale to a flat, toneless shading of unholy fire. Then it passed, like the brief smoke of a wind-blown torch. Dara knew nothing of hippogriffs, of leprechauns. He might have called it a gargoyle or a djinn, had he known them by their names. Nor was he familiar with Anubis, the dog-faced deity of the Egyptians. But the head which he had beheld was kin to none of these. Now, spread-eagle against the grate, he fell suddenly sick, the fumes of the cheap liquor he had drunk mounting in a swift, dizzying surge against his brain. Stumbling, reeling, clawing desperately outward, behind him the memory of the thing which he had seen, he gained the street, and after a headlong flight of several blocks, a park bench. But his last conscious impression ere he sank into the stupor which would last until well into the next day's noon, was of a face which seemed to float, head high, at the height of a tall man, like a face without a body, a face unspeakable, inhuman, and yet real in its terrifying semblance, half dog, half pig, whole horror. And with it, too, ere he sank like a stone into the sea-green silence of oblivion, there persisted in his nostrils a savor, a stench, an acrid, faint tang, as though the very air itself had been tainted by the passage of that nameless terror. 2. Detective Sergeant Sensabaugh, off duty at 2 a.m., went up the steps of the Varick Street tenement wherein he kept bachelor quarters. Number 32 was a malodorous building in a neighborhood grim and chancy enough of its kind. On one side there loomed the squat bulk of a stable, on the other the towering outline of a chemical plant. Sensabaugh, however, was thinking that it was his last night as a bachelor, and, consequently, his last night in number 32. For tomorrow he would be married. His last night. But tonight, despite the joyousness of his mood, there was something in the air. He felt it as a heaviness, a deadness, a breathless, weighty hush, like the tension before storm. But the August evening was close and sultry. And yet, as he mounted the worn steps, into his mind's eye, unbidden, there came a face, writhen, snarling, bestial, vengeful, the face of Duster Joe Masterman, gang leader and all-round crook, as he had last seen it on the day that Masterman had gone up the river to begin his 10-year term for loft burglary. It had been Sensabaugh's testimony which had convicted the gangster, and Masterman had sworn to get him. "You damned double-crossing dick," Masterman had promised. "I'll get you, and it'll take me just 10 years and a day. And then—" But Others had threatened Sensabaugh. There was nothing novel in it. It was just part of the day's work. The vicious hatred of an underworld for all that typified the law. An hereditary and accustomed hatred accepted and understood. Today, however, Duster Joe was out. No doubt he was even now showing himself in the haunts he had aforetime favored. Gaspipe Louie's, doubtless, for one. It may have been habit that caused the policeman to feel for his service pistol as he paused in the entrance of the hallway. But as he reached behind him, his groping fingers suddenly became rigid. A faint, hissing breath sounded from his lips as he felt his right arm caught and held abruptly from behind. Sensabaugh pivoted as a boxer ducks under his adversary's lead, whirling sideways to face the empty street. Then he grinned foolishly, clucked with his tongue, and released his coat sleeve where it had been caught in the ornamental ironwork of the banister. But he hesitated on the threshold, glancing upward where, above the black well of the stairway, there hung a faint pinpoint of gas. Sensabaugh was not imaginative, but it was his last night as a bachelor. Almost it seemed as if the touch upon his coat sleeve had been a warning, a message, a summons laid upon him by the urgency of invisible fingers. Nonsense! But the murky air continued heavy, lifeless, the unwinking eye of the gaslight somehow sinister, malevolent. As had been said, Sensabaugh was not imaginative. But now, like a swimmer breasting a tide of impenetrable and soundless flood, he mounted with slow steps the narrow stair. And about him, as he went forward, the darkness closed in like a wall. Sinister, threatening, above and beyond him that pinpoint of gas, like an evil star, now curiously bluish, flat, unreal as a flickering painted flame. Sensabaugh loosened his pistol in its arm holster, searching the thick-piled shadows massed beyond the fell circle of that brooding beacon. He drew his Colt. If Masterman awaited him somewhere upon the stair or upon the landing above, he would be ready for him. Hugging the wall for the more silent footing there afforded, the policeman, one hand before him, feeling along the plaster, the other holding his gun, went upward steadily in the whispering gloom, eyes strained against the blackness, ears attuned to the throbbing silence, like the beating of a heart. The gas offered no illumination beyond the flat nimbus of pale flame, but it seemed to Sensabaugh that if he could see nothing, there yet lingered in the atmosphere an aura, a something felt yet unperceived. Something or someone had been before him on that stairway. If he or it had passed like the passing of a candle's breath in the malodorous darkness. At the stairhead he crouched, swung up his arm, and the bright lance of his pocket flash clove the darkness in a dazzling arc to right and left. But there was nothing. He halted at the door to his chambers, shrugged, inserted the key in the lock. The heavy, soundproof door swung wide, then, following his entrance, slammed shut behind him with a muffled clang. There came a blow at the base of his brain, like the impact of a mighty hand. He staggered, stumbled, fell prone into a struggling, choking hell which took him by the threat, a rising tide engulfing him with an acrid and intolerable stench. His gun barked, once, at the convulsive pressure of his finger. But it was a dead man who fired the shot. 3. Officer Williamson passed on his beat through Varick Street, halted a moment before number 32, a puzzled look on his broad, good-humored countenance. For a brief instant, head in air, he sniffed upward like a pointer. Then, his face gray, he reeled abruptly against an area gate, his hand at his throat, coughing like a man in a fit. His side partner, turning the corner, as it chanced, at the sight of Williamson doubled over at the area gate, came on at a run, unslinging his pistol. "What's up, Jack?" he called. Then he too halted in mid-career, falling to a stiff-legged walk, as the acrid stench smote him in the face in a blinding, overpowering flood. With his last remaining glimmer of sense, his fist crashed into the glass of a firebox. Then he slumped into oblivion. After a moment, cries echoed down the street, followed by the clang and rattle of the patrol. Men came up at a run, halted, turned back. Then, out of the confusion, there arose the cry of "Gas!" But it was not until the arrival of the rescue squad that some order was obtained out of the chaos, when, following the arrival of the police and fire companies, the sufferers were treated with a vaporized solution of milk of magnesia, and Williamson and his partner removed to the nearest hospital. But as for Detective Sensabaugh, he was beyond their ministrations. Gunson, Sensabaugh's partner and friend, was stubborn in his belief that it was not altogether an accident which had been responsible for the death of Sensabaugh. "It was an accident, all right, but it was planned, I tell you, Chief," he was insisting to Inspector Murchison, his immediate superior. "If you're thinking of Masterman, Dave, you're all wrong, boy," replied old Dan. "He's not in on this. How would he be? Anyway, you know what it was. The gas tank exploded in Thompson's warehouse next door, and—" "Well, that's all right, Chief, but how do you account for the fact—" "That it got into Sensabaugh's room first? Why, that it smashed through the party wall? It was only a few inches thick there, you know, and Sensabaugh's rooms were right up against it." "Sure, Inspector, but this is what I believe." Gunson leaned forward earnestly, tapping his knee with a blunt forefinger. "I believe that someone, Masterman, for a good guess, made that hole in the wall, pushed the tank through, and then smashed it open in Sensabaugh's room, just a little while before poor Jim came home to die." He paused. Masterman knew all about tanks and gas. He was an expert before he turned yegg. An oxyacetylene blowpipe would have done it easy for him. The inspector grunted. "That's all very well, Dave," he made answer, "but there's one little thing you've overlooked. There's one flaw in your argument. Well, suppose Masterman or whoever it was got into the warehouse, breached the wall, rolled in the tank, and let out the gas with a blowpipe. Well and good. Then how do you account for the fact that the murderer, if there was a murderer, was not himself gassed? You know what chlorine is, Dave. No, it was just an accident. That's all there is to it." Gunderson's jaw set stubbornly. "I can't answer that, Inspector," he said. "I'm not going to try, just now. But as sure as Duster Joe Masterman came out of stir when his time was up, Jim Sensabaugh was murdered, and you can't make me believe anything else." He rose, his face grim with purpose. "You'll give me a week, working alone?" he questioned. "That's all I ask. A week, no more." By way of answer, the grizzled inspector bowed his head. Sensabaugh had been one of his best men. He liked Gunderson. "Go to it, my boy," he said heavily, "and good luck." Gunderson took his leave, but there was one thing he had neglected to mention to Inspector Murchison. A small thing, if you will, but a clue which had furnished him with an idea, a something he had observed at the house on Varick Street on the day of the explosion, as the fireman had issued from the house of death. This he had kept to himself, but time was precious. A day might be too little, or too much. 4. Chickenfoot Dara reclined against the bar at Gaspipe Louie's. At Louie's you can still purchase a fair quantity of hooch, for 4 bits even now, and the Snowbird Brigade makes it a headquarters too. Dara, his head wagging foolishly, his loose lips mouthing his words, retold a story for the 20th time, half to himself, half to a saturnine individual with a predatory nose and a straight gash for a mouth, who had, for some reason, bought Dara a drink. "Here's luck," said Dara. "Well, as I was saying, I seen this ghost or whatever it was as I was going into the basement door. It looked like... He paused, shivered, drained his glass. "Yes," prompted his new friend. "Like what, Bo?" He spoke in a friendly tone, yet like velvet over steel. But if Dara could have seen his face, the look in the deep-set, implacable eyes, his whistling breath might have ended in a sudden gasp. But he did not. Why, like a dog, a pig, mister," he replied. "I seen it, sure, but I don't know." His head wagged, his eyes glassy with his potions. He fumbled again with his loose lips, muttering inarticulately. The stranger cleared his throat. Then he spoke in a carrying voice. "You had 'em, sure, Bo," he asserted. "The jimmies. You'll be seeing pink monkeys and green elephants next if you don't keep your feet down. I'll say so." He glanced about the room. "Guess you're right, mister," mumbled the derelict without offense. "I had 'em bad, sure enough." And then, with an abrupt, drunken stubbornness, "'Twas Dago red wine. I ain't never seen things with Dago red wine, mister. It was there. I seen it. It moved. Right under the gas. It moved. Sure. Well, good night. Good night." He turned and swayed, lurched out into the night, a grotesque, shambling figure, misshapen, formless as the long, wavering shadow which fled ahead, cast by the sputtering arc at the corner. And behind him, he did not see that other shadow, quick, stealthy, furtive, for all of its bulk, a shadow with predatory eyes and a trap-like mouth, moving like a great, grim cat in the darkness. The shadow was nearer now, and a little wind, pattering in the dust like the feet of an invisible army of the dead, stole forward on the wings of the night, whispering, ending with a quick shriek and a sudden hush. A storm was brewing in the west. Like figures in a dream, pursuer and pursued entered a broad belt of darkness, like a deep well of night. The clump of the derelict's heavy brogues echoed for a moment across the cobbles at the intersection of an alley. Beyond it, the revealing radiance of a street lamp. He saw it, and that was all. For while the brooding blackness held, there came a snick of steel, a choking gurgle, a muffled cry, like the quick squeak of a mouse in the wainscot, a thud, silence. Chickenfoot Dara had passed on into the darkness. 5. Gunson, early in the evening, had paused a moment in his search for Masterman before the window of a store which had caused him to suck in his breath in the sheer surprise of a discovery which he was certain dovetailed with the other clues which he had turned up at number 32. He had heard the story of Dara at second hand, and now, as he stared through the dingy panes of the old curiosity shop, a sudden inspiration took him by the throat. Why, of course, that was it. It had to be, for Gunson was confident that he had seen Dara's ghost, or at any rate his counterfeit presentment, leering at him through the dirt-encrusted pane. But a hurried questioning of the proprietor, a Spanish Jew with a fondness for gesticulation in inverse ratio to his almost unintelligible speech, gave him pause, but only for a moment. Gunson, however, made a rather peculiar purchase, which he bestowed carefully in an inner pocket. Masterman, after all, need not have entered that shop. In the second place, he was far too shrewd a malefactor for that. But the suggestion remained, fantastic, incredible, as he owed it to himself to be. And Gunson, at the corner of the street, had corroboration, so to speak, when a wizened nondescript rose up almost at his elbow. "Dara, Chickenfoot. He's at Gillespie's. He said to tell yous he'd wait." And Gunson, without more ado, had sought the derelict and the saloon of Gaspipe Louis, perhaps 5 minutes after the departure of the vagrant and his shadow. Louis knew nothing, of course. That was to be expected. Gunson could spare no time to tighten the thumbscrews of his inquisition. It was going on for 11. He hurried. "That rumhound Dara been here lately, Louis?" he had asked. For a moment, as he faced the swarth Syracusian behind his stained and battered bar, Gunson was conscious of the movement at his back. A ripple, an eddy, a swirl, sudden current of electric tension. In the stained and spotted mirror, he could see but little. But at Louis's reply, "Nah, he's a bum. He go 8, 9 o'clock," and a look which he fancied that he saw in the sullen, furtive eyes of the saloon keeper, Gunson whirled on his heel in a lightning pivot. They came at him in a headlong rush, silent, no guns, knives out, life preservers, an evil ring of dark faces and clutching hands. Something hissed in a thin drawn whine at the level of his cheek. The knife clanged, quivering in the mahogany. Voices rose, bestial snarling. "Croak him! Croak the bull!" A slung shot at the end of a swarthy, hairy arm drove over his shoulder. Gunson had been trained up from the streets, the alleys. To a habit of lightning decision was added the perfect coordination of muscles steel hard and willow withered. Now he multiplied himself, the fighting flame of his Norse forebears rising to a barsark fury at the thought that these were the paid hirelings, doubtless, of a man who, he was now convinced, had murdered Sensabaugh. His fist, behind the weight of 200 pounds of iron-hard muscle, crashed into the grinning face. The face was blotted out. Hemmed in as he was, there was no time for gunplay. It was fist and elbow against knife and club in a ferocious free-for-all, of which the issue could not be long in doubt. He went to one knee under the glancing impact of a sandbag heaved upward, shook his head as a pugilist rallies his whirling wits, and then, muscle and mind and body, hurled himself in one furious headlong dive into and through that vicious ring of steel. The spank of a clean-cut elbow was followed by the groaning curse, and for the first time the crash of an automatic, and dull tsing of splintered glass. A red-hot needle seared through his cheek as, ducking under the outstretched arm of the last of his attackers, His swinging uppercut was followed by a grunt and a slumping fall. Then he was through the swinging doors and away. They would not follow him, of that he was reasonably certain, but nevertheless he went forward at a lunging run, jerking his service pistol from its holster as he approached the black maw of the alley. Then he stumbled and went to his hands and knees, fumbled a moment in the darkness, produced his pocket flash, and in the radius of that clear beam he saw, staring up at him from the cobbles, the dead face, with its straying eyes and brief, twisted grin, of Chickenfoot Dara. Masterman, secure in the knowledge that his decoy had by this time accomplished his purpose, he had had Gunson trailed for the best part of the evening, went swiftly to a room which he kept in a slightly more respectable neighborhood. This he had used often enough in the past. Gunson was aware of it, of course. Now, with that healthy fatigue which is the prerogative of thieves and murderers as well as honest men, Masterman flung himself on the bed. He was dog-tired, so much so that he had removed his coat and hat, merely, before he was breathing easily, like a man whose conscience had never been burdened by anything heavier than a hearty dinner. As a matter of fact, he had bent over to unlace his shoes, but in the very act sleep had overtaken him. If he had done so, this story might never have been written, but he did not. And he had had them on since the night of Sensaba's death, just 24 hours previous. It had required no special keenness on the part of Gunson to deduce that Masterman would do the very thing that he had done: seek his room. The detective knew the address, and, anyway, the obvious had its importance. He would try here first, at any rate. Slipping in quietly by the side door, the room was over a saloon on a quiet street. Gunson, unseen, mounted the narrow stair, listened a moment at the door on the second landing, turned the knob noiselessly, unlocked the door by turning the key from the outside with a long, thin wire made for this purpose, and entered. And so Masterman awoke at a dazzling light which struck him full in the eyes. He blinked owlishly, then sat up with a jerk, his hand reaching for his gun, and then falling at his side at a crisp voice of the detective. "I've got you covered, Masterman." The yegg cursed, stared a moment wildly, then his pig eyes snapped evilly at Gunson's other hand, reaching upward behind him, turning up the light. Gunson, putting away his flashlight, bent a hard eye on his prisoner. "I want you, Masterman," he said evenly. "You rotten killer. Step lively now, you hear?" But Masterman, his composure returning after that first, amazed glance which had assured him that Gunson was unarmed, spoke, sneeringly confident. "You've got nothing on me, Gunson," he said, his heavy face, with its blue-shaven jowls, assuming a satiric mask. "You can't prove nothing." "I have, or rather you have," replied Gunson cryptically, "and I can prove everything." He was beginning, "Shake a leg now," when abruptly there came a startling reversal. Not for nothing had Masterman abode aforetime in that haven for the dwellers by night, Paris, of the Thousand Eyes. And among other accomplishments of that grim underworld of the Apache, most ruthless of his kind, had he acquired a more than average efficiency in the art of la savate. Now, at Gunson's crisp command, he came suddenly into action. His right foot, shod with its pointy boot, swung upward in a bone-smashing kick, almost too deadly swift for the eye to follow, aimed at the detective's face. The impact of that bruising kick would mean unconsciousness, a broken jaw, or worse. But if Masterman was consummate in the attack, in the lightning upthrust of the deadly lunge, like the swift swing of a javelin, Gunson was not unprepared. There is but one parry for that abrupt passade, a single deft movement, an estoppel as swift and certain as the delivery of the kick itself. Gunson moved his head a scant half-inch to the right, as a boxer evades the whiplash of a straight left, his hand at the same instant curving in a short arc. His fingers closed like iron about the yegg's ankle. There came a quick heave, an abrupt explosion of movement, and Masterman crashed downward to the floor. He glared defiance and implacable hate, merged, however, with a certain respect. But still he rasped out, between pants of breath. "You got nothing on me, Gunson. You think you're wise, don't you?" "You've got it on yourself," repeated Gunson. Then he leaned over the fallen man, his words slow, bitter, dripping with the still acid of a corrosive vengeance. "You're slick, Masterman, but you overlook one thing, one little thing. You're in, Bo, up to your neck. Heels over head, I'll say." He barked a short, grim laugh. "I had the motive. All I needed was a clue. And I got it, at number 32, while I was watching the firemen come out. You croaked Dara because he'd seen this." With his free hand, he jerked from his pocket the purchase he'd made at Spanish Joe's, thrusting it before Masterman. A sinister exhibit indeed. The ghost of Dara's perverted dreams. A gas mask of the French type, long snouted like a boar, terrifying indeed, as an accessory to silent halls, dim night, and alcoholic imaginations. "But that isn't all, Masterman," continued the detective. "It's not a circumstance to this thing you fastened on yourself." He stopped, his voice rising to a note of triumph. "You're in, Masterman, ankle deep," he cried, bending swiftly and jerking the half-laced shoe from the foot of the murderer. "Yellow," he exulted, "and that's your brand, your Shillabar." For, as acid acts on litmus, so chlorine impregnates with its revealing color change the substances which it touches. Across and across, where the blue sock on the murderer came above the protection of the shoe, there shone a stigma of ineffable guilt, the ineradicable, unescapable, indelible proof, even as Gunson had seen it on the stockings of the firemen. The revealed and all-revealing stain, a broad band of starring yellow. The end of The Telltale Band of Yellow by Hamilton Craigie.